One of the defining questions of this moment for business leaders, for policymakers, for anyone deploying capital across borders is which bilateral relationships will hold and which will evolve under the pressure of a rapidly shifting global order. The US-India strategic partnership has proven its importance precisely when tested, and the work of deepening it remains as critical as ever. Sitting alongside it, with consequences for global supply chains, investment flows, and the framework of commerce among allied nations, is the Canada-US relationship, one of the largest and most integrated economic partnerships in the world, and one being actively shaped right now. To understand where that relationship goes from here, there are very few people better positioned to offer that perspective than our guest today. Ambassador Mark Wiseman arrived in Washington this February at what may be the most pivotal inflection point in a generation. As Canada's ambassador to the United States, he brings to that role 3 decades of experience few diplomats can claim, having served as CEO of the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board and chair of AIMCO, 2 of Canada's foremost institutional investment firms. A career built not in the halls of government, but in capital markets and boardrooms. Prime Minister Carney selected him precisely for this juncture because it demands someone who speaks a language of finance and business as fluently as the language of statecraft. He's now at the center of active negotiations between Canada and the United States. For those of us focused on the US-India corridor, understanding how our closest neighbor and ally is navigating this global reset and what it means for the broader architecture of cross-border commerce and investment is essential context. I should say on a personal note that Mark has been a mentor to me for nearly a decade and someone I hold in the highest regard. I'm deeply grateful he's here this evening. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Mark Wiseman.
Welcome, Ambassador. You've come to Washington at what is truly a consequential time and somewhat of a unique vantage point. You spent decades doing long-term capital allocation between 2 countries, but sort of looking beyond that, you know, the trade, technology, trust relationships in North America are being rewired. What we'd like to talk today is how does that lead to the future of trade? Where does a country like India fit in? And when we look at North America, for decades, this was one of the strongest examples of economic integration. Today, governments are balancing free trade with economic security, focused on industrial policy and supply chain resilience. So how do we look forward to the future of global trade? What is the role India, United States, and Canada play, and what lessons do we learn?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me, and Sachin, thank you for those kind words. I was the chair of his compensation committee prior to becoming ambassador. I'm no longer the chair, so I actually think his words might be sincere now. But look, first of all, let me start by talking about North American trade and then talk about India, because I think North American trade, since the first free trade agreement between Canada and the United States, which came into force in 1988, has benefited the continent incredibly, incredibly well. Both Canada and the US, and indeed Mexico, have seen our economies prosper as we've integrated supply chains, as comparative advantage has come to the fore, as we've made it easier for people and products and services to move seamlessly across the border. So, you know, I think the first thing I would say is that North America should be viewed as a shining example of how trade integration can benefit countries and indeed citizens across the border. Today, $2.4 billion of trade cross the Canada-US border each and every day. 120 million people cross the border each year. In fact, our 2 countries, and that's not even counting Mexico, Canada and the United States do more trade in a day than each of Canada and the United States does with many other countries around the world. And indeed, since the signing of the USMCA in 2020, trade between Canada and the US is up 27%, creating economic growth and prosperity for North America. Now, it's not always uncomplicated. And as we've seen, even with neighbors, good neighbors like Canada and the US, there are times when there are disagreements, when there are irritants, and you need to work through those. And clearly, we're amidst some of those issues right now as we come up to the 1st of July, which is Wednesday, which is the opening of the period where the USMCA agreement can be renewed. And what renewal means is an extension. The agreement as it currently stands comes to an end in 2036, but if it's renewed, it extends for an additional 6 years to 2042. So we're going into this period. But what I'd say is the change in posture of the United States, a more US-centric posture, has brought to the fore an understanding that countries around the world need to be more self-sufficient, need to be more resilient, and need to think in a more diversified way. So, and I will come to India, I promise. But for Canada, that means continuing to grow and develop our relationship with the United States of America, with Mexico, but also looking abroad to other countries who are growing around the world, who are sources of demand for our products and who are sources of supply for the things that we need. And in that regard, the relationship between Canada and India, which I think is on an excellent path, is an example of that diversification. And again, I say that it's not diversification at the expense of the relationship. Look, we share a 7,000-mile border with the United States. And if you look at the trading relationship that we have, most other countries in the world envy the trading relationship we have. We don't want to give that up, and the US doesn't want to give it up with us. But we can all benefit from being more diversified, and whether it's COVID, whether it's a change of policy, whether it's geopolitics, all of those things have made it clear that we need to look more broadly. And for Canada, a very logical, perhaps the most logical place to look in the world to extend and diversify our trading relationship is India.
Yeah, you're right. As you're trying to balance your strategic partnerships and then also remain integrated with your largest trading partner. Moving on to India, and clearly all three countries, right, US, Canada, and India, are going to have important roles to play in how the global economy shapes. And if we sort of pivot to the example, just taking one, which is technology, US offers large language models, which are critical to what the future is going to look like. Canada has talent, research. India has talent, scale, ability to deploy. So from your vantage point, what would that ideal trifecta look like? Is there room for multilateral relationships where we can leverage things like technology, but perhaps even others?
Well, look, I think India is a great example where we saw this in the early days of outsourcing of BPO businesses, where you could work together to create both better outcomes and more cost-effective outcomes for North American businesses, for Canadian businesses, and at the same time, you could also create a growing middle class in India with the great expertise that exists and the a great education system that exists in India. I think with AI, what this means is taking that model to the next level. And we have to work together as AI disrupts some of those traditional outsourcing models. But I don't think that partnership is dead. In fact, I think it's just in the early innings. And when I say innings, by the way, I mean cricket, not baseball. Look, you guys are, everybody's asleep here still. But I do think that we are in this sort of the early stages of being able to develop those partnerships. And so if you look at India, you know, what India brings to the table is an incredibly talented, base of human resource, research, flexibility, and an ability to innovate very, very quickly. If you think what Canada can bring to that table, we are, people forget, Geoffrey Hinton, who just won the Nobel Prize, the father of AI, did that at the University of Toronto. So we're a center for AI research, but we're also a center for energy. And that becomes a very important part of that partnership. So I think as we go into the next phase of technological development, just like BPO was sort of the early phases of that model, I think we have a long way to go, and I think countries thinking that they can do that alone is a very narrow-minded way of thinking. We're going to have to collaborate. We're each going to have to bring to the table what is required for this really this next phase of, I don't think I'm overstating it. I think the next phase of human development. I think it's that important in terms of what is happening with AI, and I think there's a huge opportunity for India to have a central part of that partnership.
No, clearly, you're absolutely right. I think this is a pivotal moment in history. And governments are increasingly thinking about how do we redefine talent, how do we reskill talent. Countries are looking for investment to come in. And then there's the regulatory framework, which sort of supports all of this. So as you look across, of course, North America and then into India as well, what can the government do to enable sort of, allowing companies and businesses to be able to harness this potential and then shape a technology partnership where we have trust, where we have security, where we have inclusivity. And I'm asking all of this in the context of AI.
So look, I think that the role of government is to set the conditions and create a permissive environment where the private sector and business can be in a position to take advantage of the opportunities that are arising from AI and from technology more broadly. Now, some of that is by necessity regulatory in nature, but a lot of it is about building the conditions that will allow that partnership to take place. Some of that is by negotiating comprehensive agreements like Canada and India are now doing, and where Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Carney have come together. In fact, they've met 4 times in the last just over a year, can come together and ensure that we have the investor protections, ensure that there's movement of capital and people that can allow the private sector to take advantage. In the Canadian context, it also means increasing our national infrastructure, things that the private sector can't do. So we have to make it easier for those gigawatts to come to market to be able to power the data centers of the future. We have to make it easier for fiber to be laid to get that information to the places that it needs to be. we have to work harder on transportation infrastructure so that we can move people more efficiently. So I think the government of Canada, by putting in place things like its Major Projects Office, or in terms of negotiating a comprehensive economic partnership with India, is setting the conditions for the private sector to then come in and do what the private sector does best, which is innovate, let the private sector determine which technology is going to win and which technology is going to lose, and create economic growth and resilience through that. My good friend Prem Watsa is smiling at me because he can't believe that a Canadian government official is sitting on the stage and he agrees with me. It happens once in a while, Prem. But I do think that that's where the government of Canada is today. I think that's where the government of India is today. And I think that is what is going to create a real opportunity to increase what is already a good and growing partnership. But governments have to set the conditions. If government doesn't set the conditions, then it's very hard. So we do need government. It's not the government, but we need government not to regulate and get in the way. But it's a mistake not to believe that we don't need government to set the conditions that are required by private enterprise to create prosperity.
So as governments are creating the infrastructure, the technology is there. In fact, we feel the technology is far advanced than what is being harnessed today. Do you feel that in these discussions that are taking place between governments as we're negotiating agreements, that there is enough focus on the services piece, or seems like most of these are led with goods to begin with?
I think that's true, and I think that's the traditional way that we tend to think about trade. And I think in many respects, India has turned that on its head. Infosys just being one example where services lead. I think you're right, but again, we also need the physical pieces of the puzzle to lead and to allow those services. So, I think I want to use an example of what Canada and India have announced they're working on, because I think it's heading in the right direction. I don't think it's just about goods. I think, though, you're right, it needs to set the conditions for services as well. So I've got my little cheat sheet here so I don't get the Prime Minister's instructions wrong. But so there's four things that Canada and India have announced with Modi and Carney. The first is a new strategic energy partnership. And so we know India needs energy, and Canada has excess energy. In fact, today we're exporting 4 million barrels a day to the United States, let alone to what we can export to the rest of the world. So that energy partnership with India that's been announced includes LNG, LPG, uranium, solar, and hydrogen, both expertise and physical product from Canada. So that's one. And you need those things if you're going to actually have you need energy if you're going to have a robust services partnership. Secondly, and I think this is quite cool, the Canadian Space Agency and the Indian Space Research Organization agreed to cooperate on Earth observation and intend to explore joint initiatives in space. Again, you need non-terrestrial communication, satellite communication to drive that services side of the business. You can't do services abroad if you can't communicate with each other. So if you look at what Canada and India are doing in space exploration and technology, that's the second part. Then there's been 2 MOUs on critical minerals. Again, if you think about critical minerals, they are required to drive new technology, to drive AI, the things that are required to build better chipsets, the things that are required to drive the hardware for the next generation. And so, just those are just, the start of what we're doing. And I think all those things, while they're physical in nature, I mean, uranium is a physical thing, LNG is a physical thing, but those physical things are ultimately required to drive services and technology. So that's the way that I think about it, and I think that's the way our two governments are thinking about it.
No, you're absolutely right. I guess everything needs to come together and build off, the physical infrastructure, the goods, the other elements that you need. So let's fast forward 5 years from today. And if we've been successful in these partnerships, the North America relationship, the Indian relationship, and the global economy, what would that success look like for you? And what is the one decision that policymakers should make to help us get there?
Look, I think, if 5 years from now, if we've been successful, that relationship, not just between Canada and India, between the United States and India, between Canada and other countries, between India and other countries, all of those relationships are more robust. And, having strategic autonomy doesn't mean that you're going it alone. Having strategic autonomy means that you're building relationships around the world that give you more flexibility in your own economy and make you more resilient and more self-reliant because you're not sort of single sourcing things. So I think 5 years from now, if the world has more relationships, maybe they're more likely to be bilateral than multilateral in nature. But if those linkages in that network is set up, I think we end up in a world that is safer, in a world that is more connected, and a world that is ultimately more prosperous. And I think that all starts with people, and that's why I think gatherings like this are so important. Ultimately, anything we do in business, in trade, in commerce, in government is about people-to-people relationships. And one of the things that I'm most proud of in Canada is how we have developed a multicultural society. And to me, 5 years from now, if Canada has done a better job taking advantage of the diasporas that exist within our country to link back to where they came from, to build that resilience, I think that's fantastic. Now, I will tell you, 1 out of every 5 Canadians has heritage in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that gives us a huge leg up as we look to create those partnerships, not just with India, but with other countries in the region. India is the largest and obviously fastest growing economy in the region, is the most important. But if we've increased those people-to-people relationships, created those linkages, and then allowed people to pursue success and thereby drive societal prosperity, boy, the world would be a much better place. And I'm an optimist. I feel good about us being able to achieve that.
I think you're right. I'm on the optimism train with you, and we will have a much better world in 5 years from now. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for all your remarks. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you.